Good morning. I'm Stas Margaronis, and welcome to the Strategies for Storms, Flooding, and Sea Level Defense, a joint production with the Society of American Military Engineers and the Propeller Club of Northern California. I'm Stas Margaronis. I am ably assisted by my IT, Todd Crawshaw, who, if there's any misadventures, I'm going to blame him for everything. And I want to thank my good friend Arvin Acharya for all of his help in helping to put this together. Good morning, Arvin, and thank you very much for your help. I'm going to say just a couple of words, and then I am going to introduce John Cullither, who's the Executive Vice President of the International Propeller Club of the United States, who will say a couple of welcome words on behalf of the Propeller Club. We are here because the issue of resiliency, of the challenges of climate change are getting worse and worse, and we need to act quickly. And this forum is one of many efforts by many people to try and bring together the resources that we need to safeguard our coastlines and our inland waterways, and to ensure that infrastructure includes resiliency, sea level defense, and protections against storm surges and flooding. You'll be hearing from a number of speakers who have much more expertise than myself, and they will be giving you much more detail. I should tell you that we are planning a 2-day conference in November with the Society of American Military Engineers, and we are going to solicit presentations from anyone who's interested to contact either myself or Arvin as we put that schedule together. And it will be for November, and we'll announce that date a little bit further on in the summer. In case you're interested, please let us know. We know we have a number of people who are working in the same organizations and in the propeller clubs and among the ports who really have a number of concerns and issues. And if we can bring those out, we would be glad to do so. So without further ado, I am going to introduce John Cullither, who is the Executive Vice President of the International Propeller Club, and my cohort in crime on the crime's the wrong word, John. We are on a noble endeavor. I see that we have a very scenic view of the nation's capital in the background, and John, welcome.
Thank you very much, Stas. I'm John Cullither. As Stas said, I'm the Executive Vice President of the International Propeller Club of the United States. And I would like to welcome all of you to this 21 conference on strategy for storms, flooding, and sea level defense investments. Last year, we at the headquarters level follow what's going on in Congress closely. And last year, Congress enacted the Maritime Transportation System Emergency Relief Program, which is a new program to provide grants for capital projects to protect, repair, construct, or replace equipment and facilities in the U.S. marine transportation system that are in danger of suffering or have suffered serious physical damage as the result of an emergency. So in recognition of that, last week, the International Propeller Club recognized Congressman Peter DeFazio, the chairman of the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, and the author of this new MTS Emergency Relief Program at our annual Salute to Congress event. Chairman DeFazio challenged us to help get funding appropriated for this new program. And I think your conference today could help lay the groundwork for that advocacy program. We are a maritime nation. We are going to be severely affected by increased storms, flooding, and sea level rises. We need to be better prepared to mitigate the changing world around us. So welcome to today's conference. The International Propeller Club looks forward to working with you on all of these critical issues.
Thank you very much, John. And I appreciate that. And I neglected to mention one group that we also dedicate this to, and that's to our younger people all over the world, not just in the United States. My daughter Benita and my son Christopher are both on the call today, and our children are going to be on the front end of what happens in the next few decades. So what we do right now is going to have a very, very strong impact on them. And John, thank you very much for referencing Congressman DeFazio and the very fine work that he is doing in Congress to advance the infrastructure bill. My next presenter is my good friend, Arvin Acharya, who is the president of the Society of American Military Engineers District for the San Francisco Bay. Arvin has been a long-time friend and a supporter of this conference, and has helped bring a number of same organizations together and doing the outreach that we really, really appreciate. Arvin, thank you very much, and you have the floor.
Thanks, Das. Thanks everybody for joining, and I really appreciate this partnership with the Propeller Club, because we've done one before last year, and this is the second one we're doing, and looking forward to the one in November. So certainly looking forward to a lot of the events that the Propeller Club has and the partnership that we have. We've, through the SAME organization, typically for events, we always start off with the Pledge of Allegiance. So I'm just going to run through the Pledge of Allegiance really quick and then move on to the next speaker. So starting with the Pledge of Allegiance, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. And going on to our next introductory speaker, we did reach out to a lot of posts which are impacted by this event today. For instance, we reached out to Charleston, reached out to Dallas, Houston, New Orleans. So we've had a lot of really good synergy in terms of the SAME organization and how we can bring experts and people who belong to SAME into this event. We do have, as a special guest, we've got our introductory speaker is Brigadier General Sherdell, who is the Executive Director of SAME National at Virginia. So we're really thankful that Brigadier General Sherdell could join us today. Just a brief introduction for him. There's really nothing much to say. Just three things. He's a patriot, he's a soldier, and an engineer. So that's all that's needed to say for him. And going on from here, I'd like to transfer my talk to him. So Brigadier General Sherdell, are you there?
Hey, I'm here. Can you hear me? All right. Yeah. Hey, thanks, Arvin. Yeah, I want to start by thanking John and your organization, the Propeller Club, for co-sponsoring this event. You know, I had the great opportunity of commanding the Corps of Engineers South Pacific Division right there in San Francisco. And I got to tell you, I might be sitting here in Virginia right now, but I'd much rather be out there on the bay and in Aliotos or somewhere looking out at the bay with the Bay Planning Coalition or with somebody, you know, all of us getting together trying to figure out how we solve these problems. So I got to tell you, it hurts to be sitting here. And I hope November is a face-to-face event because I will be there. Trust me. You know, you put on some great events, Arvin. You and your post do great work. Great collaboration. I remember the event, what was it, about 3 years ago, we did up in Berkeley. Great event all day. We got great speakers today and a huge, huge issue. And to the point I think John made too, our ability to adapt to what Mother Nature's handing us will determine our survival. I think we all understand that. And I think we all understand it's happening very quickly. So I just want to put a couple of plugs in. I want to thank Stas. I want to thank Arvin again. Todd is going to do a great job for you, Stas, so don't be too hard on him. It'll be good. It'll be okay. But I wanted to put a plug in. You know, I had the opportunity when I was in the Corps to be a part of the Coastal Engineering Research Board. And we actually made a 7-day trip to Holland and had a chance to get behind the scenes and really understand how that country is adapting to the horrendous challenge they have and continue to adapt. If you want to understand the ultimate of what we all might face someday, you really need to understand that issue, I will tell you, because then you really start to understand the impact that we could face. The point that I wanted, the plug that I wanted to put in, if I can, just very quickly here for today, is, you know, John, you said it well about advocating and advocacy. SAME is not a lobbying organization, but boy, do we educate and advocate. And we are committed to this issue, and we are committed nationally to join that partnership with you, John, and with other organizations to get the attention of the right people to provide the resources and the solution. One immediate opportunity that we all have today, if I can just go back to my core roots, Corps of Engineer roots, right now as we speak, up until 7 May, everybody has the opportunity to get online and comment on the implementing instructions for WRDA, the Water Resources Development Act 2020. WRDA 2020 is law. The money is there, it's there. But up until 7 May, the Corps is asking everyone to provide input to the implementing instructions. The Corps has done a great job, I will tell you, in recent years at streamlining the civil works program. And I think because of that, the Congress is going to be more inclined in the future, whether through the infrastructure bill or however the money comes, to maybe strengthen that program. So I would offer, Arvin, that a key opportunity we all have today is and now through 7 May, is to come up on the net. There are 4 or 5 different ways you can provide your comments, but I think that's important. So again, I'd like to welcome everybody, thank everybody for participating. John, thanks again for your partnership in sponsoring this event. And I look forward to seeing all of you out in the Bay Area come this November, because I'd rather be there. So God bless everybody, and God bless this great country. Thanks.
Thank you very much, General. We really appreciate your comments, and we appreciate the support that we have received from SAME. Our next speaker is our keynote speaker, and that is Melissa Roberts, who is Executive Director of the American Flood Coalition. And she is going to be discussing federal investment in flood resilient infrastructure. Melissa, we really appreciate you finding time to get together with us, and we thank you very much for being here. And we appreciate your ability to be our keynote speaker. So welcome, and you have the floor.
Wonderful. Well, first off, thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciate getting to talk on such important issues, not just because it's kind of the crux of what our organization does at the American Flood Coalition, but also I started my career in infrastructure finance. So there's nothing I like talking more about than, you know, how we fund federal investments in infrastructure, and in particular flood resilient infrastructure. So, you know, so happy to be here, and thank you again for inviting me. And I'll just share a couple slides. Wonderful. All right. So as I'm getting started, I wanted to just start off a little bit on, you know, what we do at AFC and why we're talking about investing in flood resilient infrastructure. So as you can probably imagine from the name American Flood Coalition, all we do is focus on flooding in all of its forms. And we're a nonpartisan coalition of folks on the front lines of flooding. So cities and towns, elected officials at all levels, military leaders, businesses, and civic groups, advocating and advancing solutions to flooding and sea level rise. And I founded AFC 3 years ago, largely because all of those communities and stakeholders I mentioned were dealing with more and more challenges around these issues without a lot of support. And today, as these challenges have mounted, we have over 250 members across 19 states, including 20 members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. And we really do 2 things at AFC. About half of our work is focused on the ground, helping local communities that are dealing with this increased flooding in so many forms find local solutions through providing educational resources, implementing innovative pilot programs, and connecting local leaders. And the other half of what we do, which I think has a lot to do with what we're talking about today, is really finding the commonalities and the challenges that these communities across the country are experiencing and really lifting up local voices in a unified push for better state and federal policy, which is such a clear need. And, you know, I get asked a lot why we focus so much just on flooding. And actually, people often put it that way. Why do you only focus on flooding? And it's really because we see flooding as a defining issue of our time that's affecting everyday Americans across all states. You know, from major hurricanes to tidal flooding and flooding along rivers and lakes, it's affecting folks in every state, you know, across the country, and it's coming at enormous cost that's continuing to increase. From 2000 to 2017, flood-related disasters in the US accounted for more than $750 billion in losses, making it the costliest and most frequent disaster threat in the nation. So in many ways, if we can lift up policy that addresses flooding, we can also lift up policy that addresses other hazards as well, if we can think about it through the lens of flooding, which is kind of the most common and the costliest. And I know for many folks here, flooding and sea level rise is impacting, you know, your work in terms of ports worldwide and their ability to handle goods in transit, affecting military installations across the country. And we know that nationally, our preparation, response, and recovery systems just haven't kept pace with our changing reality of higher seas, stronger storms, and more frequent flooding. And of course, you know, before we turn to solutions, I do think it's important to just think about what our future looks like, because as we're planning long-term infrastructure investments that often last for decades, we need to think about what we're actually planning for. So, you know, as many of us know, sea levels have risen 6 inches on average across the US since 1950 and are likely to rise another 9 to 20 inches over the next 30 years. And on top of that, you know, it's not just a coastal issue. We're also seeing increased risk of flash flooding and a higher proportion of storms that are categories 4 and 5. And so we can't ignore this problem and the urgent economic, infrastructure, and security challenges that this faces. And what we've seen, unfortunately, is a propensity to kind of kick this challenge down the road and address it through costly emergency supplementals. But we're finally at a place where I think we have an opportunity to really change the way we address these issues and make long-term investments. So after laying out that kind of grim scenario of what these challenges are and what we're facing, I did want to talk about some of the work we're doing to think about what real infrastructure investment could look like with a resilience lens and some of the ways we're making the case for it, which I know is what kind of unites us all in being here today. So the good news is we're talking about this at a time when there's a once in a generation opportunity to really make major investments in our country's infrastructure. And so a question that we're thinking about a lot at AFC is, how do we really make the most out of this opportunity? We know that building back communities can't simply be business as usual. We really need to invest in shovel-worthy infrastructure projects, not just shovel-ready projects. And we also know that infrastructure investments must go towards resilient infrastructure that allows communities to actually adapt to the impacts already here and those worsening impacts still to come. And we know that they need to target projects that will actually allow us to escape this endless cycle of disaster spending, which last year alone totaled, you know, $95 billion. And I think that's a really helpful number when we think about what sort of investments we have to make. It's, you know, we know what it's costing us not to invest, and it's helpful to keep that in context. And so we think about kind of 5 lenses that help make the case for large infrastructure investment and our tests of ways to make sure that infrastructure investment is actually resilient. So the first one is to really think about supporting a post-COVID economic recovery. We know that a lot of the impetus here is to be able to spur an economic recovery and put people back to work. And I'll talk about this some more in a minute. But we know that investing in resilient infrastructure can create good local jobs and spur local businesses. And I think that's a really important part of this argument. And we were actually able to put forth some research quantifying that. And I think that's the most important place to start at a time when we know Americans are suffering due to COVID. The second is really thinking about how we're investing today to avoid future disaster losses. The way that we currently fund flood-related projects is broken. We're spending billions of dollars in disaster supplementals rather than investing upfront to prevent and lessen the impact of disasters. And that has to be part of the narrative, that this is a good return on investment. And we can save not only money, but a whole lot of heartache in the long term by making smart, resilient investments now. The third piece that I think doesn't get as much airtime, but is also really important, is to think about addressing pre-development capacity gaps. So if we say we want shovel-worthy projects and not just shovel-ready projects, we want to invest in good, resilient projects, we have to think about how we get those better projects. And we know that the reality on the ground is that in most communities across the country, there isn't the technical capacity or resources to actually design great projects, right? That's not something that we've often funded. And so if we want better projects, we have to fund it. And that's also really important when we think about making sure that underserved communities have access to funding as well. And that brings me to the fourth point around really broadening equity in infrastructure investments. When we think about the flooding space, we know, and all the data shows, that flooding doesn't impact all people equally. We know that historically marginalized and underserved communities disproportionately feel the impact of flooding and the inequities in the post-disaster recovery process. So when we think about making infrastructure investments, we have to think about how to make the process accessible and how to ensure that communities that are truly on the front lines and have suffered from historical underinvestment have access to these investments that are so critical and important. And the fifth, that I know resonates for a lot of folks here, is really investing in military resilience and readiness. We know that when military facilities are flooded, or when the access roads to get to those facilities or the communities they're in are flooded, it can put our national security at risk. So we need to make sure that our military installations in their communities are ready to deploy 365 days a year, and are included when we think about investing in resilient infrastructure broadly. So that's everything we want. So what's happening now? Speaking really tactically, as we all know, President Biden's revealed the details of the Build Back Better plan, a $2 trillion plus infrastructure and jobs package. The package invests heavily in repairing and improving infrastructure, including $115 billion to modernize bridges, highways, roads that are in most critical need of repair, $17 billion for inland waterways, coastal ports, land ports of entry, and ferries, and specifically $50 billion that's dedicated to investments to improve infrastructure resilience. And one key point I'd make as we're talking about kind of how the money is proposed and divvied up is that while it's really important that we have dedicated money for specific resilient investments, we should think about spending all of the infrastructure money through a resilience lens, right? So even money that's not specifically going to, harden a shoreline or on a waterway, how do we think about making sure that we're spending it in a way that's resilient? We're not putting critical infrastructure in a place that's going to flood, that we're not, building to past conditions instead of future conditions. So I think that's just critically important as we think about spending this money, is that it can all be spent through a resilient lens. So as the House and Senate committees begin working towards an infrastructure package for September, leaders in Washington really do need to hear our voices to know that incorporating resilience is an essential component, because I think in the rush to fund big bills, this is the type of thing that can get overlooked. So we play a really important role, and we do have a really important window now. So that brings me to the last big point I wanted to make, which is just how do we make the case? How do we explain to people what the benefits are of resilient infrastructure? And one of the big things we've thought about is, some of the pieces of this case, we have the data and we've known for a long time. We know that investing in flood resilient infrastructure better prepares communities for the impacts of more frequent flooding, rising seas, and costly natural disasters. We know that investing in flood resilience makes good financial sense. We know that flood resilient projects, from elevating roadways to improving stormwater infrastructure, have a good return, right? The data shows us every dollar spent on disaster mitigation beforehand saves $4 to $7 on the back end. But there's a really important piece of this that we actually have never known, which is how do these investments create jobs, support local businesses, and boost regional economies as the money's getting spent? And so we thought, as we're having these debates about infrastructure, that was something we really needed to know. So we partnered with Johns Hopkins University's 21st Century Cities Initiative to actually look at the data and produce a report, the first and only study to actually calculate the numbers of jobs going back through the data to figure this out. And what we found was really interesting, and I think really helps make the case. We found that looking at the historical data and controlling for other variables, investing in flood resilient infrastructure does create jobs. For every $1 billion invested, it can create 40,000 jobs, 25,000 in the construction industry and 15,000 in the retail trade industry. We also know that it can help spur new businesses. For every $1 million in funding for flood-related infrastructure, we found that there's an increase of 4 construction businesses in the year of the award. And so we're seeing that really helps boost regional economies. And I know we're talking about millions and billions of dollars, but so how do we put these numbers in context? Since 2005, federal disaster assistance has totaled over $450 billion. If we were to spend only 10% of that money on flood infrastructure, it would not only prepare us for future disasters, but could be associated with up to 1.8 million new jobs across the country. And in the report, I'll mention, we did go beyond just the jobs created. We wanted to highlight what actually happens in these communities and what does it look and feel like. And so we went deep in places like coastal Louisiana, Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and Meriden, Connecticut. And these areas are experiencing different types of flooding and a diverse set of challenges, but all 3 successfully implemented flood resilience projects that brought economic growth and other benefits. And the case studies really showed how these areas experienced positive effects far beyond flood reduction risk, and also even beyond the job creation. So we saw green space that improved water and air quality, positive public health effects through reduction of combined sewer overflows, recreational space for hosting community events, and developing downtown areas into hubs for housing and transit. And one key lesson, I think, to really take away from this work is that, of course, funding is important, and this is obviously a moment to be talking about funding, but we also need to have effective flood resilience projects that are ready to go, with robust community engagement processes to gather buy-in and an understanding of a community-specific flood risk. So as we're having these conversations, we shouldn't just be thinking about getting money to come down, but also how we can think about having really good projects ready to go, since we know that takes time. So, thank you for having me here and letting me help kick this off. And very excited for the rest of the conference. So thank you.
Melissa, thank you very, very much for a very cogent and concise overview with a lot of national implications. And clearly, one of the issues that we want to get across is that the investment in resiliency has a multiplier effect. There's a major benefit. There's a major benefit to society. And as you point out, in the infrastructure issues that we are addressing right now, we have to start incorporating climate change and resiliency now, because otherwise we're going to have to pay for it later. And on that note, I want to just one housekeeping issue. Panelists, please remember I'm going to try and enforce the 8-minute rule here. And we will warn you at about 7 minutes when you're getting close. Todd, maybe you could raise that hand function when we get to 7 minutes. And that's not to say anything to you, Victoria, because I know that you'll be very succinct and in time, just the way Melissa was. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce the panel for investing in flood resiliency. And this begins with Victoria Sclafani, Senior Policy Associate with the American Flood Coalition. And she's going to be talking about highlights from the local economic impact of flood resilient infrastructure projects and tools for entities seeking federal funding for resilience, which is very germane to what we are trying to do here today, which is to start not just talking about resiliency, but the investment strategies that Melissa alluded to that we need to start pursuing. And on that note, Victoria, welcome, and you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I will just share my screen here to get us started. And all right, hopefully that is working for everyone. Good morning, everyone. My name is Victoria Sclafani, and I'm a Senior Policy Associate at the American Flood Coalition. And I want to thank you so much for the opportunity to connect with you all this morning. In my role at American Flood Coalition, I work with our policy and government relations team to really drive solutions to flooding and sea level rise. And my work includes everything from, advocating for flood resilient infrastructure projects to looking at bills like WRDA and surface transportation legislation, to working with federal agencies on hazard mitigation programs. So to kick it off, you just got to hear from our executive director, Melissa, about how we can really make the case for flood resilient infrastructure to policymakers. And I wanted to focus my presentation today to dive a little bit deeper into that report with Johns Hopkins that Melissa talked about, and also to discuss some of the educational resources that American Flood Coalition has created for our members. At AFC, our work is really driven by what we hear from our members on the ground. We think it's really important that our work is informed by people that are working in communities and other entities that are the ones dealing with flooding, whether that's planning flood mitigation projects or navigating the post-disaster assistance process. So we really we have a whole outreach team that works really closely with our members to make sure that their voices are a key part of our work. But just to jump back into the Johns Hopkins report, Melissa told you that really exciting finding that a $1 billion investment in flood resilient infrastructure could create 40,000 jobs across the country. And I wanted to explain a little bit more about how we got that number. So Johns Hopkins analysis focuses on metropolitan areas that received funding for flood infrastructure projects through FEMA's hazard mitigation programs. You've probably heard of those programs. They include hazard mitigation assistance, pre-disaster mitigation, which is now called the BRIC program. And we looked at those programs over 15 years. And we looked at flood infrastructure projects, so anything such as elevation of structures, culvert reconstruction, retention basins, flood walls, floodgates, shoreline stabilization, anything like that. And the economists at Johns Hopkins compared the ratio of employment to population in the same geographical area over time, controlling for things like year and fixed place effects. And they observed the trends in employment levels in the areas that received funding compared to those that didn't. And that's how we found that this $1 million increase can create 40 jobs, 25 in the construction industry, and 15 in the retail trade industry. And obviously, when we're thinking about investing, we're thinking in the billions, hopefully. So that's where we got that number, 40 billion jobs. And another thing about the report that's interesting is that the economists were able to develop job growth estimates specifically for each congressional district based on variables like that district's economy and education levels. And that's really important when we're talking to members of Congress, because members of Congress really want to know, well, how will this affect my district? So that's really helpful in making the case. And Melissa also mentioned that a $1 million increase can create 4 new businesses in the year of the award. Diving in a little bit further, we also found really positive findings that flood infrastructure projects stimulate economies close to home. In one example in Louisiana, we found that about 80% of contracts went to local businesses, local contractors in the region in coastal Louisiana, and 99% went to in-state contractors. So we really found in multiple places that these aren't going to, businesses that folks have never heard of. It's really stimulating the economy at home. And Melissa also mentioned the case studies that we discussed in the report. There's dozens included in the report, but we really dove deep into 3. And I'll just highlight one of them in Meriden, Connecticut. We found that the city laid out a 14-acre public park that doubles as a floodwater bioretention green space. And this was a really interesting example because on top of those economic benefits, we found that this park really revitalized the economy. It helped remediate environmental hazards and created kind of a public meeting space right in the downtown. So that's just a bit about the report. So anyways, we're using this Johns Hopkins report to highlight the economic impact of investing in these projects and to push for additional funds and programs to policymakers. But I did want to discuss a little bit about what this means for entities at the local level that want to implement resilience projects, but might not know where to start. So that brings me to some of the resources that we've created at American Flood Coalition. We know that for entities and communities that want to implement projects, the federal grant system can be pretty daunting. There's over 900 programs across 26 agencies, and figuring out which program to use, how to apply, that can be a big challenge. So at American Flood Coalition, we created a tool called our Flood Funding Finder, which is an interactive tool that identifies 24 federal programs that fund resilience. And I'll show you on this slide here what the tool looks like. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen that you're able to filter based on characteristics such as what the program funds, how much funding you need, and the tool will provide to you a customized list of programs that fit your needs. So this is really helpful for communities, particularly smaller communities, but a lot of other entities are also eligible for these types of programs. This is free on our website, and I encourage you to check it out. And I know my time is short, but I did want to mention another guide that we recently put together that's also available on our website. It's called Adaptation for All, and it is a guide that really breaks down different approaches to flood solutions and also kind of identifies by cost and types of benefits what might be the best fit for different entities that are looking to implement projects. I will close there, but I definitely encourage you to check out both the Johns Hopkins report and these tools on our website. And if you're interested in membership at the Flood Coalition, I also encourage you to reach out to me or to our outreach team. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Victoria, thank you very much. And we'll get to questions at the end of the panel. Thank you very much for staying on time and with a very succinct overview of the American Flood Coalition products. Our next speakers are Mike Kaminsky and Sheree Lewis-Groos from First Street Foundation. They are going to be speaking about First Street Foundation and the Flood Factor Assessment Tool. Mike and Sheree, welcome. And Mike, I believe you're beginning, is that correct?
Correct. I'll kick it off and Sheree will navigate slides and I'll hand it over to her very shortly.
Thank you.
So I'll kick it off. Good morning, everyone. Just thank you all for coming out today. As Stas says, my name is Mike Kaminsky. I'm a senior adaptation specialist at First Street, and I'm presenting alongside today my colleague and lead adaptation specialist, Sheree Lewis-Groos. And we're very excited to be here today to talk to you about our organization, First Street Foundation, and our flood risk assessment tool, Flood Factor. Next slide, please. So a little about First Street. We're a nonprofit with the mission to communicate risk from climate change at the individual level. And we started with flooding, and as Melissa acknowledged in her keynote before, it's the most costly natural disaster in the US. Over 1 trillion of inflation-adjusted dollars since 1980 due to damage from flooding. It's also readily linked to climate change. So that's why we started there. And First Street currently offers publicly available flood risk data for 142 million individual properties on Flood Factor, which is essentially the lower 48 United States. Next slide, please. So at First Street, we acknowledge that FEMA is the regulatory authority for flood risk mapping, and just want to make it clear that our goal is not to be antagonistic, but to be a complement to FEMA. FEMA offers a great service of broadly communicating flood risk across the 100-year floodplain. However, this might not always resonate with the public where science and mapping literacy isn't always as high. So for First Street, by democratizing personalized flood risk assessments and by making our data really easy to understand, we are trying to enhance the message and be just another big megaphone around flood risk. That said, we should acknowledge that FEMA maps are often out of date and large portions of the country have never been mapped. 75% of FEMA's maps are out of date by their own standards of needing to review and update their maps every 5 years. And moreover, about 40% of the country has just never been mapped. So as a smaller organization and without being bound by Congress, First Street has the flexibility to more fill in these knowledge gaps. And also along the lines of not being bound by Congress, consider that First Street doesn't have to deal with factors outside of raw data influencing our flood maps. So FEMA is a federal organization with a lot of stakeholders, and there are quite a few political challenges to mapping that First Street just doesn't have to face. I should also point out the map that we've included on the slide. This map just demonstrating a comparison between First Street's mapped risk of the 1% annual event compared to FEMA. It's based on the differences in number of properties at risk. Darker blue represents higher numbers of properties, First Street map properties at risk compared to FEMA. And just judging by the blue hue throughout the map, you could see that we show roughly 70% more properties because of some of the reasons I just mentioned, such as having a more current and complete national model, independence from political stakeholders, but also because of a few other unique aspects within our model, which I will go into. Next slide, please. So this is a brief overview of First Street's flood modeling process in the beginning, where we model every major flood type before rolling these into one combined probabilistic flood risk model. So our model includes things like tidal events, like your highest monthly king tide. We model precipitation or pluvial stormwater flooding as a standalone risk, also riverine flooding and hurricane flooding. And right here, pluvial modeling, or our pluvial modeling, is one way that we complement FEMA, where FEMA doesn't model pluvial flooding as a standalone risk. So there's lots of stormwater flood risk away from the rivers and coasts that FEMA models so well. So again, our goal is to help complement FEMA by filling in these gaps. Next slide, please. This slide demonstrates at a very high level a very high level take on how we overlay our data and determine risk for individual properties and homes. We start with parcel data and building footprint data being a property level model. We add in our combined hazard layers, which combines the flood risks across all the individual flood types that we showed on that previous slide. To run our statistics, we find a max flood depth at the edge of a building footprint or at the property centroid if it doesn't have a building footprint. These stats are run for a variety of flood events, everything from the small 2-year event all the way to the extreme 500-year event. And these are rolled up to provide the flood factor scores that you'll see on flood factor when Sheree talks about them shortly. These scores range from 1 to 10, 1 being low, minimal risk, and 10 being most extreme. And they're based on 2 components, one flood probability or frequency, and then also your depth of flooding. Next slide, please. So another feature that makes First Street's model unique for flood risk estimates and looking at planning is it incorporates future environmental changes. Generally, flood maps and models are based on historic data where they don't factor in changes due to climate change, such as sea level rise, increasing tidal flooding and storm surge, and increasing surface area temperatures, meaning more intense precipitation events. So what First Street's model does is it factors in future environmental changes through RCP, or representative concentration pathway trajectories of greenhouse gas concentrations that have been adopted by the IPCC. And we use an RCP curve of 4.5, which is described as the intermediate scenario. And from there, we use 21 different CMIP5 simulations, applying that 4.5 curve to estimate the range of flood risk uncertainty into the future due to climate change. Next slide, please. So another really cool feature that makes our model unique is the incorporation of adaptation data, which is very relevant to our discussion today. Typical national flood models tend to rely on well-established data like elevation data, hydrology, land cover, that sort of thing. But also, as we're going to talk about today, humans have a very real impact on where flooding can occur. So we wanted to incorporate adaptation to our model, but when we went to look at where this data was, we realized quickly that there actually isn't a complete centralized database of adaptation projects across the country. As an example, the NLD, the National Levee Database, is considered the gold standard in national flood defense databases, but it only contains 30% of our nation's levees. So this being the gold standard and only one adaptation type, there's clearly a lot of room for improvement. So that's why my team at First Street, led by Sheree, we developed the first ever national database of flood adaptation projects. And today we have over 23,000 unique features accounted for from 850 unique sources, ranging everything from levees to seawalls to pumps, green to gray. And these features are baked into the model and mimic the real world protection offered by this important infrastructure. Next slide, please. So this slide is just showing that our data comes from a variety of sources. I'm not going to get into the weeds today, but the thing to note is that we rely primarily on open data sources, especially federal data. Next slide, please. And on the topic of relying on open data, I'd also like to point out that First Street's detailed technical methodology behind our flood risk model is also open. We're committed to transparency, and this documentation is freely available on our website for anybody who would like to review our methodology and really dig in. I'd also like to point out the map here where we show areas of increasing future flood risk, darker purple areas mean increasing risk, and by our numbers, as much as 1.6 million more properties will be at risk by 2050 of at least a centimeter of flooding reaching the base of that property's home. And it's mapping insights and information like this that we discuss in detail in our first national flood risk assessment report that we published last year, also freely available on our website. And I encourage you all to really dive in and check that out. Next slide, please. So at this point, I'm going to pass the mic over to my colleague Sheree, who will be providing a live demo into our online flood risk assessment tool, Flood Factor. which is the publicly available application of all the research and work around our flood model.
Thanks so much, Mike. And thank you, Stas and the Propeller Club for having us. We're very excited to be able to present our work to you today. So I'll be talking about two things, the flood factor tool and also our newly minted public sector pilot data share program. So we have a number of ways in which we share and disseminate data. Mike touched upon a big one, which was our national report, available freely to download. And also another really big communication tool we have is our flood factor tool available online. So what makes Flood Factor unique is that it's the first open source peer-reviewed climate adjusted solution truly available. It is produced at the 3-meter resolution, and also every single 142 million properties in the contiguous 48 are available on Flood Factor. We hope to have Puerto Rico, Alaska, and Hawaii available soon, so stay tuned for that. Additionally, it's endorsed by the National Association of Realtors. And excitingly, we are now on realtor.com and redfin.com. So when property home buyers and sellers and renters are looking to move, they can really understand their flood risk in a quick and digestible format. So we don't have too much time today, but I do want to take some time to quickly show you Flood Factor. I would love to spend 20 minutes showing you this, but Stas, I will respect our time limit. So this will be a very, very brief introduction to Flood Factor. I hope and encourage you to go online and type your address and do some digging yourself. So on Flood Factor, you can enter your address, zip code, city, or state. You can scroll down on our landing page and you can find links to many of the reports we talked about, including the national report. Here are some national statistics about risk and how risk changes in 30 years in the US. Properties at risk increased by 7.5%. So let's go straight into a property. Here I chose 200 San Juan Avenue, San Francisco, California. If there's anyone on the call that has this address, please message me after, because that would be completely random and freakish and I will go buy a lottery ticket afterwards. But this address actually has a 6 out of 10 flood factor. Mike described the flood factors before. It's a metric system that we developed using our statistics, looking at risk today and over 30 years. They go from 1 to 10, 10 being the highest risk. So 6 is pretty much in the middle. It's a major risk. Here is our navigation bar on the side. So first, let's explore these summary statistics. One of our newest tools is our average annual loss tool. And what's really interesting about this is that the individual can learn about their likelihood of flood water that reaches this building in 15 years. So in this case, what's the likelihood of 0 inches reaching their building? 89%, not too bad. If we say 12 inches of what's the likelihood of 12 inches reaching their building in 50 years, it drops to 39%. Really what we want people to understand is how does this flood depth and risk affect their flood damage estimates. So we can go to adjusting the building details. Does this building have a basement? No, yes. How many stories are in this building? If we don't have the exact right number and you say, actually, my building is 4 stories. And I actually have 4 feet of elevation as my first floor elevation. I hit save and you can see that actually the annual flood damage goes down to 0. So it's an interesting tool for exploring risk and how your risk can change based on your first floor elevation. Moving on, we can see how your flood factor compares to your neighbors. Here I have the major category clicked on. You can click on extreme, severe, moderate, and you start to see the geographic distribution of your neighborhood, of the homes and their own individual flood factor. As well as you can click on, let's say, major over here, you hover, and you can see that San Francisco County has 2% of its property with a major flood factor, which is quite high in my opinion. Moving on, we can start to understand, this is really for the individual, how much flood waters that enters into a property, what does it impact in terms of the infrastructure of the building. So this is less than 6 inches. If we go to 2 to 3 feet, there's a lot more infrastructure systems like furnaces and HVAC systems that are impacted, another tool the user can explore. Most importantly, I think, is all the statistics Mike was describing are really seen here. So this is where our hazard layers are projected. Here we're looking at the 0.2% of flood reaching your building in 2021. We also project in 15 years and then in 30 years. And how does that flood risk change? If you zoom out, you can start to see how the map looks for the rest of the county. We can again adjust the building details here and see how much damage will occur to the structure. Moving on, we can see about environmental changes and understand how they will change over time. So for this case, we click on sea level rise, we hit 30 years, and you can see how these arrows increase because this is based on NOAA projections. Moving on, we want to make sure that the user feels empowered to do something about their flood risk. We don't want to leave people feeling despondent. We want to leave them feeling hopeful and like there is a possibility for them to do something. So in this case, we give all these different options in terms of adaptation to your individual property. When you search by city, we give adaptation options at the community and the city level. We do green, gray, and then community infrastructure resilience measures. And I want to highlight as the last thing on this page, again, as a very brief overview, if you go up to the top over here and click on solutions, you'll be brought to this page. And here's when you really can do a deep dive into your individual solutions for your home. And you can click on learn more, and there's an entire knowledge article that you'll be brought to with lots of resources on what does the sump pump mean? What can it do to protect your home, for example? Then we move on to community development. So you can limit development within the floodplain, for example. You can click on learn more, and there's a whole article about where you can learn about this resource. So I implore you to explore Flood Factor and explore our solutions page, and let us know if you have feedback. We're always open to that. So the next and last thing I will talk about is how our data is now being made available to the public sector. We have Flood Factor, which is available to any individual for non-commercial use. We have commercial sale of our data to keep our lights on as a small nonprofit. And now actually we're entering into a pilot program where we are sharing our data for free with public sector agencies. We've worked with federal agencies, state and county agencies so far, and we're excited to work with anyone on this call that's interested. Please get in touch with Mike and I. So from a high level overview, we currently have aggregated statistics available on our Amazon AWS platform, which is available through the Amazon Open Data Registry. Those statistics are aggregated at the congressional district, county, and zip code level. These two maps show you the distribution of that aggregated data. Most interestingly, within this data set, which is freely available right now online, is FEMA properties at risk in 2020, First Street properties at risk in 2020, and then the difference between First Street and FEMA properties at risk. And then also you can look at the average risk score, so that number 1 through 10 of homes within the FEMA special flood hazard area, and then homes outside of the special flood hazard area. How do you get this data? Well, Stas and crew will be sharing our presentation afterwards. Follow this link. You'll be able to get it freely, easily on AWS. Again, contact us if you have any questions. And last, as I close up, I want to tell you a little bit about this public sector data access pilot program that we have. Really, our goal is to understand how communities can really accelerate their climate assessments and planning of their flood mitigation efforts. And we want to do that by freely distributing our hazard model data set. So all the statistics you see on Flood Factor are already available for free, but they're not available at the individual property level in a bulk download. This program allows us to share that bulk download of those individual property level statistics with government agencies. And we see that this helps us maximize the use of the First Street data that we spent so many days and nights producing for the public good. And we really recognize that sharing it with government agencies will allow this data to be leveraged for immediate use and service to the communities that are at risk for flooding. So when you get this, we have a little form, an application. It's very brief that you can fill out. You can also email Mike or myself, mike@firststreet.org, Sheree@firststreet.org, and get in touch with us and let us know your interest. Thank you, Stas and the Propeller Club, for having us today.
Sheree, thank you. And Mike, this is very, very interesting, very timely. The level of detail that you guys have produced is really very impressive. We would like to work with you to get this out as much as we can. I think that this is very, very useful. And I'm just awed by the amount of data that you put in here. I'm looking at all of the stuff that you guys put in there, and I'm trying to figure out, well, even at my age, I think I could probably follow it. You've made it very user-friendly, and thank you, both of you, very much. We want to follow up with this, so I will be back with both of you about this because we want to do something with you on this. Our next speaker is Kathleen Schaefer. She is a PhD candidate and former FEMA engineer. She's going to be talking about natural disaster risk, liability, or asset. And she's kind of had the stage set for her by the data that's been presented by First Street and by the American Flood Coalition. We've had some very interesting talks about how risk needs to be much more assessed in a lot of decision making, and we've talked about that in terms of infrastructure. So Kathleen, you have the floor. Welcome. And we look forward to your discussion.
Great, thank you very much. Let me just share my screen. I want to thank Stas for setting this up and for providing wonderful opportunity for me to share. And I want to thank my colleagues who preceded me because they have really set the stage for what I would want to talk about. I am a prior FEMA employee, and I'm convinced that there's a better way, that we can use this new data to find a way to manage our risk more effectively at the community level. So with that, I want to just start by just reminding everyone that one of the challenges we do face is that flood risk is a low probability, high consequence kind of event. And the research says that we have a hard time processing that kind of information. Daniel Kahneman, in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, highlights the fact that we have a hard time getting our traditionally fast brain thinking into thinking in this way. But one of the things the scientists tell us is that we can understand these risks better through stories. So I want to start and just say a very short story. Like all stories, it starts once upon a time. Once upon a time, there was two computer chip manufacturing companies, and they were located not far from each other. The first computer chip manufacturing company hired a insurance firm, and the firm said, you know, we think you have a flood risk. We will help you build a wall around your company, a flood wall, and in exchange we'll lower your flood insurance. So thinking that was a good deal, the first company went ahead and built a flood wall. The second computer chip manufacturing company did not. And as can be expected, the floods did happen. And 3 days after the flood event, the company with the flood wall was back in business. They dusted everything off and they were up and running. The chip manufacturing company that did not was not. So the first company, they were up and running. And in fact, they had to hire new staff. Lots of new folks because the rush of orders was overwhelming. lo and behold, as the computer chip company that did not have their flood measures and was not actively managing their risk, they were begging their buyers to hang with them, but time is money, and the buyers of their computer chips went to the one that could deliver. The moral of the story: a year later, the company with the flood wall bought their competitor for pennies on the dollar. So those companies that can manage their risk, there's a story that if you manage your risk, you can monetize your risk. And along with that, I want to just kind of highlight that these are the Chinese symbols for risk. The first symbol represents danger. The second represents an opportunity. And this view of risk as both a danger and an opportunity is increasingly being adopted by corporations around the world. In the past, corporations and organizations assess their risk in silos, with insurance, operations, credit, and commodities each conducting their own narrowly focused and fragmented activities. But now, under an enterprise risk management system, all risk areas function as part of an integrated and strategic and enterprise-wide system. CEOs and their employees share a common view that risk management is an integral and ongoing part of the job. So what if we took that same approach in our communities for natural disaster risk? In 2011, the World Economic Forum convened a panel of experts to envision a new way of thinking of natural disaster risk. The recommendations from this report focused on raising awareness, enhancing resiliency, and encouraging preparedness. And in this new vision, everyone has a role to play. The private sector can lead the behavior change by example. They can support broad-based efforts to collect appropriate data on risks and to make the data available. They can leverage the financial resources of insurance and banking to finance risk mitigation. So under this new vision, risk is spread around among the capital bases that are best able to manage them. In this vision, risk transfer methods of traditional insurance, reinsurance, microinsurance, catastrophe bonds, and local catastrophe pools are optimized. And so what could that look like? Well, using California as an example, my colleagues at UC Davis and I have been examining what if California were to adopt its own version of flood risk and flood insurance. We now, in the past years, California has contributed over $5 billion more in payments than they have received in claims. Right now, we are getting ready to go into a drought. There's warnings that a drought is impending, and water restrictions have started. So we look at what happened during the last drought period in California. From 2012 to 2016, during that period, California residents paid in almost $1 billion in NFIP payments. Because we were in a drought, there was only about $20 million in claims. So the question becomes, and the research that we're working on is, what if a part of that $1 billion that was paid in was instead used and monetized to buy down risk? So that's the question, and that's kind of the research, and it builds on the comments that have just been said. What if we had a community-based flood insurance program that worked collaboratively with everyone together and used the new data that's available to actually buy down risk? I'll open it up to questions or turn it back over to Stas. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Kathy, thank you very much. What I would like to do is, we've got a couple of minutes here for questions. I have a quick question for Mike and Sheree, and that is, you've talked about the FEMA data being not being current, And I was wondering how much of a problem does that pose when people like Kathy are saying we need to start making assessments, and the people who are making those assessments are not using your excellent data, but they're using the older data. How do we change that situation?
You know, that's a great question, Stas, and I actually think Kathy is the perfect person to answer that question. Having such a long career in FEMA, and now, you know, being so connected to people at the state level in many states on the Western Front and at the university level. Interestingly, we are actually working with Kathy and the university, and Kathy is putting us in touch with state level agencies to fill in the gap. But I have to say it's not easy. But let me maybe pass it to Kathy, if that's okay, Stas, to answer that question about maybe some of the problems and issues that come up in places that are unmapped.
Thank you. Kathy?
Sure. So it's actually a two-part problem. You have places like Simi Valley that overestimate the flood risk. They haven't had new maps since the first maps were produced in the 1980s. And it grossly overestimates the risk. So people are paying in Simi Valley much more than what they should. Then you have other areas that are newly developed. There's areas like in Reading that I know of, and several others that 30 years ago, when maps were done, they were cornfields, and today they're subdivisions. And so many people may have a risk that they don't know about. So one of the challenges we currently face is this disconnect between, where is the risk and where do people think the risk is. It'll be interesting to see what happens. As I'm missing out as we speak, there's a conference going on where David Marstad is presenting Risk Rating 2.0. So that will also change the way the conversations are currently held. So stay tuned for Risk Rating 2.0.
Kathy, that would be very interesting for us to follow, as well as to understand how that works. We had Ricardo Lara, the California Insurance Commissioner, speak to us in 2019, but the kind of level of sophistication that you brought here, I think, needs to be more generally available.
Yes.
Other questions? We've got time for a couple of questions. If anybody has one, they want to put up their hand. Has anybody got a question? Of our panelists. Going once, going twice. I don't see anybody, so
This is Derek Chow.
Yes, Derek.
How are you, sir? Aloha, good morning. So I wanted to ask Shirai, the Corps of Engineers has a very stringent requirement for having new models not only verified, but approved before it's used in Corps feasibility studies. Have those models that you've been talking about been approved by HEC, the Corps of Engineers and HEC?
Hi, Derek, thank you for the question. I think you are talking about, for example, the National Levy data set. Is that right?
Not,
which models in particular?
Not necessarily the National Levy data set, but any of these hydraulic models that you're using to demonstrate, flood risk and flood levels and flood inundation areas. Has the Corps already approved those models?
They have not. They have not. Our models cannot be used right now for regulatory purposes. But as Mike said, all of our data and our models are open and transparent, and they are peer reviewed. So the model itself has been published. Different components of the model has been published, peer reviewed in scientific journals. So if we could get the Corps or other agencies to work with us on perhaps approving our model, that would be fantastic, because I think it could help answer maybe part of what Stas was touching on earlier, like how do we get communities to use, for instance, our model in places that don't have the model. And, I should say, like, the First Street Foundation dataset is not the only model out there, and we are not trying to supersede local hydrologic models. Really, our model doesn't incorporate things like operational procedures, but it does really good job in all the other ways that Mike described. I also implore you to connect with us, because we have many recordings that we did via the public sector that go very deep into the modeling components and explain how we've actually produced our entire data set. So that was a long answer to your question. It has not been regulated by the Corps or approved by the Corps. I personally am not sure if there's a path with the Corps, but we have been making sure that we speak with many federal agencies, including FEMA, including the Corps. Right now, there are different federal agencies that are using our data set for R&D purposes. HUD, FHFA, EPA, some of the Federal Reserve Bank system, DOI, they are all entering into agreements with us to start to use the data to explore it. So perhaps there is a pathway that we can get our model kind of stamped and sealed with approval from the Corps or another agency.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Derek.
That's a very good question, Derek. Thank you. And as General Schroedel discussed earlier, we are trying to get more money into the WRDA budget to support the Army Corps of Engineers, but they need the best available data possible. And if your data is an improvement over what they have, obviously something needs to happen to help that process along. So we would definitely encourage that. And we have a lot of sane people here who can help that out. And I'm seeing some chat information as you are, Shirai. So I think you're going to be followed up by a few people who work with the Corps, very interested in what you're talking about. So guys, thank you very much for that. And we are now going to move on to the state responses panel. And our first speaker is Jeff Barisco, who is the Senior Project Manager, Programs and Project Management Division with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And he is going to be talking about the proposed Mid-Barataria sediment diversion. Jeff, I see you there, and welcome. And you have the floor. Good morning.
Hey, good morning, Stas. Can you hear me?
I can.
Excellent. Let me get in presentation mode here real quick. Of course, it keeps flipping on me, so. All right, are we full screen, Stas? Good to go?
We are good to go.
All right, excellent. So thanks everyone. Thanks Propeller Club for having me on today. This is really kind of a landmark thing for the New Orleans district where I work. I am a senior project manager, and most of my career has been in civil works, but I'd be very remiss if I didn't point out that this is not the Corps of Engineers project that I'm about to present on. And in fact, I'm going to present from the applicant. So this is actually a regulatory project that's being undertaken by the state, which is why I think I'm being slotted in the state response. But it's good that I'm giving this because it's really the federal view of it. What we've been doing, we are putting together the draft environmental impact statement, but ultimately we're going towards a record of decision on this project, right? So just a little bit about the applicant, Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. They are the single state entity for flood risk management and for ecosystem restoration in the state of Louisiana. So their agency's scripture, so to speak, is to put things on the ground that bolster the coast. For everything that's inland, that's not in the coastal zone of Louisiana, that's handled by the Department of Transportation and Development. So it's an interesting nuance. The state also does a master plan every 5 or 6 years. I think the law just changes to every 6 years. It's a $50 billion, 50-year plan. So the state is very much, I think, in a lot of ways ahead of the game on trying to set out what they want to do. Now, of course, the problem is always money, right? But in the case of this diversion, they are actually planning to use Deepwater Horizon oil spill monies. So I'll get to that. I've got some stats on what it costs and all that. It's all very, very interesting stuff. I've been working on this for 5 years total, but 4 years since we had the original EIS kickoff meeting. So you can tell that it's been a long time. This is a very complex document. It's only about 1,600 pages, a little light reading, if you will, a little federal war and peace. In any case, and then the last thing I'll say is that no decision's been made. So the Corps is right now soliciting input. So we're in the middle of a public review comment period, and I've got some slides on that. So I'll go ahead and progress here. So this is CPRA. If you ever saw a presentation by them, you would see what we call the red map, which is on the left. And that is what happens if you don't do anything with relative sea level rise. Red is not good. I think everybody knows that. You can see it. We live in a deltaic floodplain, and CPRA, in fact, the next slide I'll probably show, argues that when levees went up all the way down to, and let me see if I can use my cursor here, just to kind of point, you can actually see where the Mississippi River levees are. And that's about all that's left in this map, right, is what's inside the levee system. So the state's kind of arguing that what's going on here is bad. You know, we lose a football field of land every 20 minutes. And this is the why for CPRA. Why do they want to build sediment diversions? They want to do a lot of things. It's not $50 billion worth of sediment diversions, but it is a crucial part of their plan. And then just on the right here is just to give you an idea, Port Fourchon and Grand Isle. Port Fourchon services a lot of the oil platforms. And then Grand Isle is a huge recreation, lots of camps and whatnot. But you can just see the immense loss from 32 to 2011. All right, so this is another CPRA slide. I would tell you that the top right bullet here, the levee systems restrict rivers natural process, that is not necessarily the Corps' position. You know, the levees do a lot of things. One, they protect over 2 million people just in Southeast Louisiana. Two, they also ensure and help ensure navigation, which, you know, I am talking to the Propeller Club right now. I think there's an interest there in maintaining navigation. The port system on the Mississippi River is if you take it all combined, it's the largest in the Western Hemisphere. It's just a huge amount of commerce up and down all the way to Baton Rouge. There's just nothing but ports along here. So, but what the state is saying here is that, and this is actually when Bonnie Carey, one of our own diversions the Corps has put through the river, which I should say now that the Corps is not unfamiliar with diversions. We just have never really built a sediment diversion. They're saying when you're flooding, these plumes that you can see are going off the continental shelf here, or they're going in Lake Pontchartrain, which is here north of New Orleans. And you're not doing anything with all that sediment where it could actually be captured and build land. So that's kind of like the impetus of why the state has actually looked at these things. But of course, the Corps even looked at these things in documents before. But like I said, the state is looking to use money that they have through the civil penalties from Deepwater Horizon. So they've gone the regulatory route versus doing it through a civil works program where the Corps would cost share these diversions. So here's kind of a cross view of what this diversion will look like. This is from 30% design. And essentially you're looking from the Mississippi River out to the Barataria Basin. And I'll just switch back real quick. So Barataria is right here. And so the river's here. And so what you're looking at is it going from here to out to here. So this is a huge undertaking, right? And y'all can see the stats to the right, but the length of this is 2 miles, and this is concrete riprap. And it goes through the Mississippi River levee, so there's a concern for the Corps. It also goes through what's going to be called the New Orleans to Venice non-federal levee, which is a hurricane and risk reduction protection system. So there's another issue there for the Corps, right? And then I don't know how much anyone knows about diversions, but when you have a diversion, immediately downstream, usually what happens is the water, because it's slowed down, right? You're taking some percentage of the flow off the river. It's going to slow down the water, and thus sediment falls out a little bit more. So we have to ensure that the federally maintained Mississippi River ship channel that's so vital to commerce is not being impacted either. So that's how the Corps is involved. And then from the Section 10404 perspective, which is the ecosystem impacts, that's why we're doing an environmental impact statement, because while the perceived benefits of this, reconnecting the deltaic processes, building almost 20,000 acres of land are great, there's massive impacts that can be occurring in the Barataria system. Some examples of that are it will change the ecosystem. This influx of fresh water into a semi-saline environment can impact commercial and recreational fishing, impacts dolphin populations, just a number of things, tidal flooding for people that are outside of these risk reduction systems. They can be impacted by the tidal flood. So the impacts themselves are part of the reason why we're doing an environmental impact statement. So moving on, you can see going all the way back, we got a ton of scoping comments back in 2017. Fast forward to now, we literally just completed last week our 3 virtual public meetings. They were pretty well attended. We've gotten over 2,000 comments during the comment period already. You can see it goes through May 4th. We already extended a typical draft environmental impact statement time period is 30 days, or I'm sorry, 45 days. We extended to 60 days unilaterally, just knowing the interest and the complexity of the project. And then you can see the out dates there. Final EIS, 30 days, cooling off period is known by some. And then a record of decision. That's where the Corps will decide whether or not to proffer a permit on this action and permissions. But I did want to speak a little bit about just how big this is. It's not just the Corps making a decision. We also have what's known as the Louisiana Trustee Implementation Group. Go ahead and highlight them. They're all right here, along with the cooperating agencies. So like the normal things we would deal with, like the services, NRCS, et cetera. But then we're also dealing with the folks that are tasked with administering the $5 billion worth of civil penalties against BP for Deepwater Horizon. So we've concurrently, multiple national level memorandums of understanding, agreed to do one EIS to rule them all, to kind of borrow a Lord of the Rings thing. It is basically they're going to do their restoration plan. You can see it right here circling. And I'm sorry, was there someone that broke in? Okay, sorry about that. And Shirley here. Sorry, someone is bleeding over. Okay. In any case, this just gives you an idea of all the folks that are working on it and why it's so complex. There's just 2 federal decisions here, very, very difficult stuff. And so finally, if anyone here, if you want to go read about it and you have actual comments you wanted to make, the lines are open, so to speak. Comment portals through the National Park Service. It's not that National Park Service is running it. It's just they have something set up that's called Pepsi. It works really well. It helps us bin all the comments and deal with it. And then, of course, we've already been through the live virtual meeting schedule, so that's immaterial at this point. But we do have some requests to extend the timeline. So with that, Stas, I'll cede. Hopefully, I didn't take more than 7 or 8 minutes, but it's very exciting.
Thank you, Jeff. This was very good. Thank you very much. Very timely. And very interesting. This is a real challenging project. And this brings us to our next speaker, Alexander Kolker, who's Associate Professor at Louisiana University's Marine Consortium, who has been following this. And his topic is sea level change in coastal Louisiana, implications for coastal resilience, and the mid-Barataria sediment diversion. Alex, welcome. Glad to have you on board. You've heard Jeff's presentation, and what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's great. I think Jeff did a really nice job of explaining explaining the process. I hope maybe I can get into a little bit more of some of the details and the complexities. There are a lot of twists and turns with this. You'll have to excuse me if you hear the thunder and lightning in the background. We've got a little bit of a rainstorm here in New Orleans. But hopefully maybe as an academic, I might be able to provide a little bit more insight onto some of the complexities and concerns that people have, since I'm a scientist and a scholar, and so I'm just going to try and represent this from that perspective, rather than from the bureaucracy perspective, which is important. So the short story of why do this in the first place, right? As Jeff mentioned, the Louisiana's lost an enormous amount of land, a little less than 2,000 square miles worth of land over the last century. And the mid-Barataria is designed to mimic some of the natural processes that originally built the Delta. So short story, you send the sediment-rich river water into an open bay, and as the flow slows down, spreads out, it slows down and sediment falls out. And this is an aerial photo of the Cubits Gap Sub Delta, which is a little bit about 5 miles south of Venice, Louisiana, and about just north of Head of Passes. This is a series of maps of Cubits Gap for over a period of about a little over a century, essentially showing that this area created something close to 100 square miles worth of land. Essentially, you had a sort of fan-shaped building of land in the Mid-Barataria is designed to mimic these natural processes.
Hey, Dr. Kolker.
Yeah.
Apologies, I'm sorry. I don't know if you're trying to present, but I'm just seeing video right now. Sir, of you.
You're just seeing video. Oh, I apologize. You know what? I must have gone and, you know what? Thank you. Zoom goof. I forgot to hit share screen.
Okay, we can see it now.
Great. Apologies, Zoom. Apologies for the Zoom goof. View slideshow. So this is the Cubits Gap Sub Delta, and this is the map of land building. Apologies for the Zoom goof. Just a quick map of coastal Louisiana and some of the major structures that we have up here. Here's New Orleans. This is about where the Mid-Barataria sediment diversion is going to come in. This is the Cubits Gap Sub Delta that I mentioned. This is the Carnarvon diversion, which is another smaller diversion that's currently in existence. I'll talk to you a little bit today about a diversion over here in West Bay. This is the location right over here of the Bonacary spillway, which Jeff mentioned earlier. The Mid-Barataria is large. It's going to deliver about 75,000 cubic feet per second of water at a cost of a couple $2 billion. So it's a very large and expensive project. But it should be kept in context. There are larger and less expensive projects out there. West Bay, which is over here, is an ungated structure designed to build about 10,000 acres of land, though it hasn't gotten to that level yet, and that diverts about 25,000 to 50,000 cubic feet per second. It's built at a much lower cost, about $50 million, but there's no gates on it. And so it's a harder structure to control, and some of the concerns that Jeff alluded to, you're not able to mitigate in West Bay. Bonacary can divert a whole lot more water, but it's not designed to build land. It was built for about $14 million, probably less in 2021 dollars. But it's not really an ecological system. It's just designed to get rid of flood water so they don't impact New Orleans. There's a bunch of positive trade-offs, plus and minus with this system. It's on the positive, it's designed to build somewhere in the range of about 15 to 20 square miles of land. It's going to reconnect the river to its delta, and the sustained input of sediment is critical for marshes to keep pace with sea level rise, and it could provide ecological benefits for freshwater dependent species, some like bass and alligators. There's some negatives that Jeff alluded to. Shoaling, you could get shoaling in the Mississippi River, which is an important channel for navigation. The diversion could impact existing flood control structures, and it might result in reduced productivity for saltwater dependent species like oysters. There are ways to mitigate that through by building, for example, a gated structure, and indeed some of the costs of the Mid-Barataria are associated with these gates that are designed to, and other structures designed to reduce negative impacts. This is one study that I played a role on that came out of my research group looking at the Cubits Gap Sub Delta. Are these systems going to build land? So we looked at land loss in the Cubits Gap Sub Delta over a period of about a decade, and sort of land loss and land gain. The short story is we found land gain in areas closer to the river, areas that I'll show you had higher sediment loads and increased sediment deposition whereas your land loss tend to occur in your further out areas, areas that have lower sediment loads. If you also look at that in terms of geotechnical properties, these are the areas that have increased sediment deposition. These tend to be the drier areas. These also tend to be the areas with lower loss on ignition, so lower bulk. So that's essentially more mineral rich sediment, which the source of that mineral rich sediment is the Mississippi River. These are the systems that tend to be your land gaining systems down here, are your systems, if we look at a salinity map, these are the systems with lower salinity. Your higher salinity wetlands out here are the areas in this system that had increased erosion. These are also your more dense sediments, and also the areas that had higher shear strength. Your higher shear strength sediments were over in here, and your lower shear strength sediments were in here. So essentially, the model is these areas that are closer to the river, the areas that had increased sediment depth, that had increased mineral sediments. Those were the sediments that had that where you were building land. The areas further from the river where you had less sediments, those were the areas that were more prone to erosion. In this case, in a period that included some intense storms, including Isaac and Katrina. Isaac, Gustav, and Katrina. So short story, closer to the river, at least in this area, seem to be better. In Cubits Gap Sub Delta, these both sedimentation rates and rates of relative sea level rise are in the range of about 1 to 4 centimeters a year, so a little less or a little more than an inch a year. If you're going to think about implications for diversion for the future, diversion should be located in areas that have similar sedimentation rates and lower subsidence rates. Mid-Barataria is an example of that. If we scale out to the future in terms of a period of accelerated sea level rise, this is the state's map of land change under various scenarios. We've got, this should be, for some reason this didn't come out. This was the low rate of sea level scenario, and this is the high sea level scenario 50 years from now. And what we're seeing is areas near the diversion generally have land building in the low sea level rise scenario, though there's a lot of land loss in areas of further south, and in areas and in the high sea level rise scenario, still some land building, but increased land loss coastwide. And we're seeing something of a similar pattern here. So the sort of take home message is these systems look like these diversion-like systems look like they can build a substantial amount of land if, and this is the big if, rates of relative sea level rise are kept under control. And of course, one of the big ifs in that is the rate of global sea level rise, and that is controlled by climate and the decisions that we make about greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so with that, I'll just I'll close that out, and I'll just say I'll say thank you to Stas and to everyone here Stas for inviting me, and thanks to y'all for listening.
Alex, thank you very much for this. You've provided a lot of detail. I know that we've challenged you with the 8 minutes here, but there's a lot of very interesting information. The situation in Louisiana is critical. The success of this kind of project is critical. And as you point out, there are some unknowns that we really need to be better acquainted with, and that is, what is the true level of sea level rise? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And if anyone has further questions, I'll put my email on the screen.
We'll see if we can get some questions at the end of the state responses. But Alex, thank you very much for that. We're next going to California, and Jonathan Camp is the acting chief Office of Smart Mobility and Climate Change with the California Department of Transportation, known as Caltrans. And Jonathan, we are interested to hear what is happening in California and some of the issues that you're facing. So, excuse me, Jonathan, you have the floor. Jonathan, are you there?
Hello, can you hear me?
I can. Jonathan,
Okay, great.
Go ahead.
Let me share this presentation here. Okay. Here we go. All right, so here in California, let me just show you, just to set some of the context we're looking at here in California. A lot of the talk about climate change in California over the last several years, maybe 10, 15 years, has been kind of linked to GHG emission reduction, kind of led by our Air Resources Board. More recently, we're seeing historic levels of wildfires. We're really starting to see some of the impacts to the transportation system increase. And really, from a policy perspective, we're seeing that shift reflected in some of the policies coming down to Caltrans to implement. I think it started, we have AB 32 that passed a while back, tying more to reducing GHG emissions to 1990 levels. Since then, there's been executive orders B 3015 and N 1919. They're really looking at incorporating GHG emissions into investment decisions and planning documents. But more recently, with SB1, we passed that. It created a lot of funding recently for us in the transportation sector here. But with that, built into the law and the subsequent program guidance coming out of that law, there's been more of a focus on addressing climate adaptation through those competitive programs. Recently, our California State Transportation Agency, which is an agency that sits kind of above Caltrans and some of the other transportation agencies, like our Department of Motor Vehicles, and the governor's office, they've recently released a draft plan that's actually out for comment right now, called it's the Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure. And that's kind of putting forth a framework that they're working with our California Transportation Commission that kind of controls the funding guidelines and everything. It establishes a framework basically for integrating climate change considerations into some of our investment strategies. So we are kind of seeing that shift in the policy. More what we're doing here in Caltrans, just to look at what we've been doing over the last couple of years. Focus more on actual vulnerabilities of the California transportation system. We're broken out into 12 district offices. So each district developed a climate vulnerability assessment on identifying vulnerabilities on the state highway system. It looked at 6 stressors: sea level rise, storm surge, cliff retreat, precipitation, wildfire, and temperature rise. We also developed a statewide vulnerability assessment at the regional level, right? It's difficult to get an understanding of what's going on. So we just recently completed the statewide assessment, kind of looking at statewide trends. So that effort was primarily to just identify the vulnerabilities. The next step we took was to really prioritize those vulnerabilities for investment. Right, so we developed a series of district climate adaptation priority reports that really looked at, it assessed all the vulnerabilities that had been identified in the vulnerability assessment and prioritized them based on exposure, how likely the event was to occur, and consequences, right? If it does occur, what's the impact on the transportation system? So we recently released, I think it was just in February, towards the end of February, we just wrapped up the last of our 12 district adaptation priority reports. Those are all being put on our website. Additionally, we've stood up a ArcGIS online mapping tool. So this climate vulnerability data can be made available via ArcGIS web map. Just an idea of a couple of the more extreme examples coming out of the climate vulnerability assessments. On the left here, we're showing the wildfire risk in our District 2 office, which is basically the northeast corner of California along the Oregon border and the Nevada border, all the way down through, I guess, like the Reading area, almost to Chico. Looking at the wildfire risk, the light red is high and the dark red is very high. So we're projected, with temperature rises and those types of things, projected, we're looking at pretty substantial wildfire risk there in our District 2 area. I think probably a number of you have heard about some of the wildfires in the last year or so in Paradise. They've been pretty severe. On the right side is a look at the sea level rise in the Bay Area. I think you'll see most of the east-west kind of corridors here on the Bay side of the district are really high impacts. We're projected to have 1.75 meters of sea level rise there in our Caltrans District 4 office. So most of these are bridges, and then you'll see some of the highways right along the bay, such as Highway 37 and Highway 101 along the south there are really at risk here of sea level rise. On the ocean side, interesting, we're not as risk of sea level rise because the higher elevations, but that's where we're seeing more of the cliff retreat and slip out type impacts from the sea level rise. So it is impacted. It's just not shown. It's just not showing up as inundation, right? Let's see. So here's just how, like, an overview of the process, how we kind of plan to use this information. We talked about identifying the vulnerabilities and then prioritizing them. We have what's called a state highway system management plan that kind of lays out the funding plan for our state highway operation and protection program, or maintenance and operational type projects. They will try to, with the release with the federal transportation legislation, MAP 21, there was a requirement in there for state agencies to implement asset management. So this is our plan for implementing asset management. In order for us to be able to get a climate change performance target into that plan, we first need to go through the process of quantifying the vulnerabilities. So after this step, we hope to be able to quantify a need in that plan. So far, we've just been talking about the vulnerabilities, right? Not so much the solutions. This information should feed into our long-range system and corridor planning process. So when you go and look at a corridor and identifying the needs along the corridor, you can take some of the identified vulnerabilities from our reports and start talking about conceptual strategies and improvements needed to address those. Project nomination, we need to really think about what projects we're putting forward, both on the state-sponsored projects, but also as we partner with our locals. We now have a document showing where our priority adaptation areas are, right? We can begin to start those conversations with the locals to let them know these segments are our high priority segments, so we can start that. Integrating into our project initiation document. That's our scoping document prior to funding the project. Now that's pretty critical. That's where all the alternative analysis is done. So we're hoping, once the vulnerability is identified, it's planned for, right, and then scoped and funded.
Jonathan, you gotta finish up here. We're getting close to your time.
Okay. So we've done a facility level assessment, right? Looking at one project. Basically, it's not feasible to do that for every vulnerability, but we're looking at how to integrate it into our process at large. We've had a number of studies looking at Caltrans operations, basically our processes and procedures, and made some recommendations to us how to improve GHG emission and mitigation, as well as how to integrate climate adaptation into our process. We've recently released a Caltrans strategic management plan with a goal to lead climate action. You'll see in there the top one, we are going to develop a Caltrans climate action plan. That's basically going to look at the recommendations, right, and come up with strategies on how to implement over the next few years. Next steps, we want to look at some stressor specific guidance and training. We want to look at developing a statewide adaptation priority report to tell us what the highest priority in the state is. And then just if we can identify and quantify a need, if there's political will within the state, it could eventually lead to a long-term funding source. Currently, we're trying to leverage funding from sources that are not specifically identified for climate adaptation. So I'm done, I think, Sauce. Thank you.
Jonathan, thank you very much. Our next speaker is Jeremy Lowe, who's a coastal geomorphologist with the San Francisco Estuary Institute. He's going to be discussing integrating landscape resiliency and transportation planning in the San Pablo Baylands of San Francisco Bay. And one of the areas that Jonathan featured was Highway 37 in the North San Francisco Bay, which is in the neighborhood of where Jeremy will be addressing. Jeremy, good morning, and you have the floor.
Good morning. Can you see my slides?
We can.
Okay, thank you, Stas. Jonathan mentioned the vulnerability of east-west connections in San Francisco Bay. So I'm going to talk about State Route 37, which runs across there in the northern part of the bay, but it also runs across Lower Sonoma Creek, which is an area of 10,000 acres of diked agricultural land that was formerly marsh. And I've been working on the restoration of those low-lying areas with a large number of organizations, thinking about how this area is going to change, the whole landscape is going to change as sea level rises, and how it becomes more challenging to maintain levees. So this same area is also the home for State Route 37, which traverses either present or former marshlands for its entire length. It's an important regional link between Marin and Solano counties, but it suffers from congestion, like many roads, and is increasingly vulnerable to flooding, and we do get flooding quite regularly up there. I'm going to talk about a conservation strategy developed for the area and the evolving collaboration between habitat restoration and transportation planning along this corridor that reflects a symbiotic relationship. We need to restore the habitat, but we also need to plan the road, and we need to do those things in concert. The map on the left shows in green the route of State Route 37, hugging the north shore of San Francisco Bay. It was constructed in 1929, and at 21 miles, it's the shortest route across the North Bay, connecting the city of Vallejo and the county of Solano in the east to the city of Novato and county of Marin in the west. Today, it is an essential commuting route, connecting people who live in Solano with jobs in Marin, and serving particularly many who live in disadvantaged communities. Alternative routes to the north and south, shown in red and blue, are few, constrained by the bay's geography, and are considerably longer. The map on the right shows the historical marshes in green through which the road runs, and I've shown the road there in red. All these marshes would have been open to the tides and sediment of the bay. These marshes are about at high tide elevation and can maintain this elevation as more sediment is deposited. However, In the 19th and early 20th century, many of these marshes were diked for agriculture and salt production. So the diking and draining cut off the land from the bay tides, prevents the deposition of sediment, and leads to the dewatering and oxidation of marsh soils, and ultimately subsidence of up to 6 to 7 feet. So this whole area is very low lying, below usual tide levels. So while the dikes keep the tides out and allow the land to be used for agriculture, they've also increased the vulnerability to flooding and future sea level rise by lowering the land. And you can see this in the vulnerability of the area to flooding from the bay depends on the water levels in the bay, the ground elevations, and the levee crest elevations. So I tried to demonstrate this in this slide, and we have elevation in feet on the vertical axis. The blue column on the far left shows the height of regular tides, highest tides, and a storm surge, which, if occurring together, could result in something like 10 feet of water level. The green column shows the typical ground elevation in the dike baylands of about 0 to 2 feet. And this is what the road runs on in many places. The orange column is today's levee crests, about 8 to 11 feet, which serve to protect the area from today's floods. And in places, the road is protected by the levees. In other places, it is actually on a berm about that elevation. And the pressure on these levees and the pressure on the road will increase as sea level is projected to rise by up to 3 feet or so towards the end of the century. So in this aerial photo, we're looking west to east. In the middle of the photo, we see State Route 37 running from the top to the bottom, the bay, and I can use my cursor, you can probably see it runs right through the marshes like that. The bay is on the right, and Sonoma Creek is the channel in the foreground. Levees protect this side of Sonoma Creek, and you can see the green of agricultural fields in the subsided former marshes down in the bottom of the photo. On the far side of Sonoma Creek, the road runs on a berm between marshes on one side and former salt ponds on the other. The road will be vulnerable to flooding from the bay as sea level rises, but the road also acts as a barrier to water and sediment and wildlife that move across this landscape. And this is the nexus between the habitat restoration and the flood protection. The road is not the only infrastructure in the dike baylands, however, that is vulnerable to flooding, and the bay is not the only source of floodwater. In this aerial photo, we're looking north to south from the hills towards State Route 37 in the far distance. The bay is at the top of the picture, and you can see the diked agricultural parcels with their levees following the historical creek baylands. You can also see a rail line cutting through the parcels. This is an active railroad. And this flooding, but this is flooding not from the bay itself. This is flooding from inland, from floodwater from Sonoma Creek and from adjacent watersheds, which regularly breaks out of the channels, is impounded by the same levees that keep the bay tides out. Since the floodwater cannot escape to the bay, these areas can be inundated for weeks. So we have two significant pieces of infrastructure, several sources of flooding, and we're looking to restore this landscape because we know its vulnerability is going to increase as sea level rises. And there's very little economic benefit to maintaining all these levees. So the road berm and the levees, they impact the connectivity. They act as barriers to water, sediment, and wildlife, interrupting the surrounding watersheds connections with the marshes in the bay. And these ecological connections mean that the area impacted by the road and the source of potential flooding is much greater than just a simple strip adjacent to the road. It is arguably the extent of the historical baylands, shown here in these green and orange and tan colors. And is likely that these areas will also be going to be restored to tidal action, either by design through a restoration project or by accident as they breach as sea level rises. So planning for State Route 37 requires a landscape approach. It needs an understanding of that bigger landscape which the road goes through, and it needs to consider different environmental conditions as well as different alignments and designs. So this photo shows the existing State Route 37 crossing at Sonoma Creek. It is designed to accommodate the existing channel and marsh floodplain. But as sea level rises and more areas become tidal, water flowing under the bridge will increase, eroding the channel and marshes and potentially scarring the bridge pilings. A new roadway needs to accommodate these future flows or be relocated to avoid such flows. Simultaneously with the State Route 37 planning process, we've been developing a conservation strategy for these baylands. And this strategy considered the likely restoration activities over the next few decades, together with the potential impacts to to the road and also the railroad. And it's estimating the potential future flows and sizes of future channels. So just to finish, the map on the left is a sort of an idea of the strategy, the new landscape that we're thinking of planning for in the next few decades, restoration over 10,000 acres at a cost of several hundred million. But State Route 37 is the red line at the bottom and the railroad is the blue. And what we've done was we provided recommendations about the restoration, but we've also provided recommendations about how to accommodate the existing transportation infrastructure and to inform future transportation planning. So a large number of organizations were involved in development of this strategy, and these ideas are now being advanced in ongoing planning discussions hosted by the Metropolitan Transportation Agency, Commission. Alternative collaborative meetings of these organizations with transportation planners and engineers are providing early input on the redesign of State Route 37. So it's a work in progress, and I thank you all for your attention.
Jeremy, thank you very much. What's the estimate on getting the road elevated and doing the environmental work?
The estimate of time or of money?
Money.
Oh, I think you have to have a B in there. It's 6 billion or something like that. It depends what you do. If you raise it up on piling causeway, then it's pretty expensive.
Okay, Jeremy, thank you very much for this, and we'll have questions after the end of our panels. Our next panelist is Catherine Roscoe. She's a senior flood risk and adaptation specialist with the Dutch firm Deltares. She's going to be talking about coastal flood resilience support system for coastal communities across the US and demonstrated through a pilot project in the city of Charleston, South Carolina. Catherine comes to us from the Netherlands, so saying good morning is probably incorrect. Good evening, Catherine.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Stas. I'm really excited to be here and really thankful for the opportunity, and I've really enjoyed everything that I've heard so far. So as Stas said, I'm from Deltares. It's a Dutch applied research organization. We are not-for-profit, and later in the session, in the Dutch portion, my colleague's going to tell a bit more about Deltares, so I'll leave that to him. What I'd like to tell you about is an initiative that we're doing with the Department of Homeland Security, developing what we call community flood resilience support system, and its application in Charleston, South Carolina. So, just before I tell about the tool, just to sort of motivate what we see as the need for this tool, a lot of the things we've sort of heard from people already earlier in the session, we know that change is coming, and we know that it's really uncertain. And as people are planning for climate adaptation, there are a lot of choices to make, and it's not always clear which actions should be chosen and when they should be implemented. Meanwhile, there are a number of drivers of risk. We've seen this in some of the previous talks. We have rising sea levels, increasing storm frequencies, increasing strength of storms, increasing precipitation. We've got population growth and development going on. And we also have increasing economy, which means the assets that are at risk are also becoming more valuable and driving up the risk. So these are all contributors to increasing risk as we move into the future. And sorry, the question is, what is the system response to all of these drivers? How is our flood risk increasing as all of these different drivers are changing in the future? And not just the drivers, but the choices that we can make. So we have options, we can implement adaptation options, we can implement drainage infrastructure improvements, seawalls, we can elevate homes. We have a lot of choices available to us, but how do all of these different choices influence our system response in terms of risk and flooding? For some reason, my arrows aren't working, so I have to very carefully do my mouse. So to understand the system and how it's responding to all these drivers, modeling needs to be easier and it needs to be faster. So communities need to be empowered with tools that they can use to be able to answer tailored questions that are relevant for that community. So for example, these are questions like, what if a Category 4 hurricane comes just north of the city? What if it comes just south of the city? What if we put in a seawall? What's going to happen with rainwater backing up behind the wall? What's going to happen if the population rate doubles? How is risk distributed over income classes? And if we install a drainage pump, how long is that going to work? How long before flood levels are no longer manageable? These are examples of the kind of questions that communities want to answer. And this was the motivation to develop this project, this research and development collaboration with the Department of Homeland Security and the City of Charleston to create a support system to help communities address these kind of questions. So this is a conceptual idea of what we call the Community Flood Resilient Support System, or the CFRSS. And central to it, it is a tool, but central to it is the idea of a community. And so here you see these questions that I was reading on the previous slide. These are the type of questions you hear in a lot of communities. There are many different types of these questions. And the idea is that this tool has an interface through which you can model different combinations of projections, events, and strategies together to combine them into what we call a scenario. And once you've defined one or many scenarios that you're interested in, then this gets fed into what we call an integrator. And the integrator is like the brain of this tool. And it essentially takes that information and modifies model input as needed and runs a flood hazard model and a flood damage model, so that for each of these scenarios, a community can see what is the flooding and what is the impact. And by running a lot of these different scenarios, these are then fed into a viewer, and this viewer is designed to be configurable so that it's really designed to show the data that's interesting to answer the specific tailored questions of that community. So that gives you kind of an overall idea of the tool. This is a very more sort of technical diagram of the tool, which I'm not going to get into. What I really want to illustrate on this slide is the two components of this tool that make it really powerful. It has a built-in compound flood model called Sphinx. This is a very fast physics-based compound flood model that models compound flood events due to rainfall, wind, tide, surge, river discharge, and it combines these to produce a combined flood event and the flood map that goes with that. And also, and this model, while it's physics-based and accurate, runs at a fraction of the time of some of the more in-depth, complex physics-based models. So it's very fast. And we also have a fast flood impact model that's sitting inside of there. And together these can run a scenario in less than a minute. So this really lets you run many different scenarios, which is needed also when you want to calculate risk. So I want to move a little into the Charleston application, which is coming. So we haven't done it yet. And Charleston has done a lot of work in adaptation. And so it was interesting to talk to the Chief Resilience Officer there, Mark Wilbert, and I wanted to know from him, how does this tool fit into all of this other work that's going on in the area? And I really liked his quote, so I just wanted to quote it here. What he said was, "This tool will help show benefits and even the playing field. We'll be able to compare the effectiveness of different measures in different areas and find out what is effective where and for how long." And I think that really captures a lot of what the tool can do. And what I want to do in the next couple of slides is just take you through 3 use cases that we foresee for Charleston. So the Army Corps has recently looked at a flood wall going around the peninsula, which is the sort of economic hub of the Charleston area. And the idea is this is a great solution for this area, but there's a lot more to Charleston City than just the peninsula. So, what's going to happen in West Ashley, where you have a lot of residential areas that are prone to flooding, same as James Island, a really popular residential community. that's also prone to flooding. So the idea is, which actions can we take where to make sure that the risk reduction is distributed evenly over the entire community? What are the best portfolio of options? And this tool can help them answer those kind of questions. Another use case has to do with essential facilities. So this is a map showing fire stations, and the idea is that you can use this tool to identify for a lot of different essential facilities, so fire stations or substations, evacuation centers. You can identify what is the risk currently to these facilities and where can you maybe best move them or build new ones in the future, looking towards how risk is evolving over time. The third application, which the community is most excited about, I would say, is adaptive planning. So this is, I could present about this for 20 minutes and I won't, but the idea of adaptive planning is to sort of turn the typical question, well, let me start here. You see here a bunch of different adaptation options. And typically what people want to know is, with one or two different scenarios in 2060, how is this measure going to hold up? But adaptive planning turns that question on its head and it says, under what conditions are these actions no longer going to meet a specified objective? And that objective, I could talk about that for a long time, but you can think of something like a flood risk tolerance. And the idea of this, you see here sea level rise on this axis, and it's showing you that you can look at not just cost benefit type of information about your options, but also how far into the future are they going to get you in terms of these changing conditions. I put sea level rise here, but this can be combinations of different conditions. And then the idea of this is that you can build up a pathway into the future by basically sequencing measures so that you can always continuously throughout this pathway meet those objectives that you've set. And I could really talk about this a lot, and I know we're really short on time, so I won't, but this is an exciting application for them. And this tool is really suited to give this kind of insight by looking at risk as sea level rise and other drivers are increasing. So I just wanted to end this talk. I wanted to say that we're really excited about this tool and we feel like it's really going to fill a gap for adaptation planning, but we also have a lot of ideas for future development. And these are some of them. So just to kind of spurn some of these ideas, and if you have any of your own and you want to get in touch or hear more about how this tool works and the application, please do. But these are some ideas to, for example, include waves so that we can also look at the risk reduction benefit of nature-based solutions and other wave attenuating type of measures. Another idea is to include a network analysis tool, which essentially looks not just at the direct impact to roads from flooding, which the current tool does, but looks at the impact on accessibility. So are you going to have trouble accessing hospitals or evacuation centers, and who's going to be having trouble with that access? Another potential future use that we can imagine is operational forecasting. So you know that there's a storm coming in, and instead of just having that sort of hydrologic information, also understanding what is going to be the impact to the community if this storm hits. And the last one is has to do with this adaptation planning, the adaptive planning. We essentially can imagine this tool being a kind of an engine through which you can do sort of automatic calculations of these tipping points, how how much of a certain condition and adaptation measure can handle before your objective is no longer met. So these are some ideas, and that's it for my presentation now, but I really want to encourage anyone who's interested to get in touch with me, and I can tell more about it in a less hectic pace. Thank you for the opportunity.
Catherine, thank you very much. And again, this is a lot of information for us, which you've developed here some very interesting strategies that, with all of the data that we're looking at, has to somehow be integrated. And we've had some discussion about the Sphinx system and how that would work, and how that gets to people on the ground, which we will try and come back to in questions if we have some time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Our last speaker is Mary Davlasheridze, who is the Assistant Professor, Department of Marine Services at Texas A&M University at Galveston. And I've asked Mary to come back. She spoke to us in November about the price of not investing in the Texas Coastal Spine, which is the project that the state has developed, a $26 billion project to protect its coast that includes nature-based solutions and a $12 billion storm surge barrier to protect Galveston Bay. And it's at $26 billion. The question is, what happens if you don't do that? And this goes to the question that we've talked about earlier about the benefit of infrastructure and how infrastructure pays for itself via the risks that were discussed by Ms. Schaefer, by the investments that the American Flood Coalition people have talked about, and also First Street. So Mary, without further ado, I give you the floor and welcome from Texas.
Thank you, Stas, for your introduction. Can you all hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, great. It's a pleasure to be able to come back and speak to this audience about these pressing issues that we all face, in particular in Texas. Just to briefly summarize, I don't think I have to reiterate this problem, but I think tropical cyclone-induced storm surge is one of the probably unarguably the most devastating aspects of the tropical cyclones, and many of the low-lying areas in the United States and also worldwide, and also in particular Gulf coastal communities are particularly vulnerable to the impact. And some of the assessments about how much risk assets are at risk is estimated that these asset losses could reach around $990 billion by 2100. And one of the concerns that particularly has been highlighted in academic literature is that with the sea level rise, the occurrence of these storms that have the differences in the return probabilities could increase in terms of the frequency, because sea level rise creates this higher launching points, and this could potentially exacerbate the storm surge impacts on local economies. In some of the research that we have done, we particularly look at the Houston Galveston area, primarily 3 counties around the Galveston Bay, and I will show a map on the next slide. And why we worry about this, because there is a significant number of people who live in the coastline, around 4.42 million people, which are projected to increase to up to 6.3 million, if not more, by 2040. And it's also a hub of the nation's largest refineries and petrochemical facilities, and some of the critical infrastructure such as Houston, Port of Houston. And in terms of the economic significance, of course, this region contributes at least a quarter of the Texas state economy and employs 62% of the labor force in the states. And combined output value from this chemical manufacturing, mining, oil and gas extraction services is estimated above $294 billion. And this is a map of the area I'm talking about. So we have the Harris County, Galveston County, and Chambers County, which are sort of surrounding counties to the Galveston Bay. There is more comprehensive assessment that was done by U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, that they look comprehensively along the coastlines of Texas to estimate what could be the sort of strategies to implement various adaptation strategies, including the coastal barrier, including the wetland restoration, engineered beaches, and so on and so forth. But specifically for our research, we have looked at this coastal barrier, which would sort of create the gate, perhaps, to suppress the surge impacts on the Bay communities, because we had an incident in 2008 in response to Hurricane Ida that has significantly damaged the infrastructure, including property damages and the others public infrastructure that were vital. So to sort of talk about what is a price of not investing in these structures, it's important to understand what are the impacts of these events. And of course, one that's very obvious is the direct damages, and the direct damages we estimate in terms of the property damages. And one of the most widely used models that we used was FEMA HAZUS model to estimate these property damages. And we updated this model to incorporate some of the property level features, structural characteristics. And another impact that could be sort of estimated directly, and it's obvious, is the impacts on the petrochemical and oil refineries and manufacturing sectors. These damages, unfortunately, are not very easily available, and also the asset damages are not as important for them as much as the cessation of production operation, because they were shut down for precautionary purposes, or there is some sort of important system that was shut down due to the storm surge event. So we sort of think that this industry would suffer this productivity loss because of the surge impacts, and this productivity loss is not necessarily coming from the capital or the labor, but overall total factor productivity. And we have looked at the locations of these plants. We know how much the annual output they produce, and we considered several shutdown durations, such as 18, 26, and 33 days. If they have to stop their operation because of the massive storm surge that hits the area, what could be the ramification, implication of such shutdowns? And after we estimate these direct impacts, then we were interested, what is the economy-wide impacts of these events? Because maybe residential impacts are more localized and they do not have much of the effects of others. There could be some important impacts from the petrochemical and refineries sector, because they are all connected to the other sectors of the economy through the prices of the production inputs. And of course, the prices changes after such surge event. There is a shortage of inputs, outputs, and this generates sort of ripple effects on the economy. And also there are changes to the personal income, which in addition creates another sets of the indirect effects. And in looking at these cost estimates to the national economy, it's always the national or the local regional economies. It's important to have the reference point to which we compare to estimate the loss relative to where we would be. And we consider this the business as usual scenario, where we assume there is no storm surge and the economy goes at its projected rate, grows, and we have the historical projections for population growth and saving rates and all of these things. So we sort of project economic growth based on these estimates. And the second one, we also estimate the economy with the storm surge primary sectors that I've discussed, and then we calculate this difference to estimate the impacts of the storm surge between the business as usual scenario, where we don't have any storm surge effects, and the economy with the storm surge. And this is our impact estimate. Just to give you sort of a brief synopsis of our results, we have looked multiple storms. The 500-year storm is one of the rarest and also most intense and destructive, and 100-year has an annual return probability of 1%. And we looked at 10-year, and also we have sort of resimulated Ike-like storm, because this was one of the largest storm surge inducing events that we experienced locally. Just in terms of the direct losses, we like 500 storm, of course, generates the largest impact, over $16 billion in terms of the property and output losses. If we assume that this plant shut down for 33 days, followed by 100-year storm, over 6.6 billion in terms of losses. 10-year storm does not generate so much losses. Its impact in terms of the petrochemicals and refineries is much smaller. And the Ike-like storm was very close to the estimated or actually observed damages that we have seen as over $3.7 billion. And I'm going to just present the results in terms of the gross GDP or the state products in Texas economy. what we find, and I think it's one of the interesting things, we shocked this economy in the beginning of the period. So we started with 2016, and we were interested how much this impact could last over the long term. And we looked 50-year time period, because this is sort of reasonable time period where economic agents also make sort of planning, as well as some of the major infrastructure investments commonly are considered for over 50 years period. And what we found is that initial impact in terms of the loss of the GDP is much smaller than the long-term impact. For example, initially we estimate this impact to be in about 18 billions in net present value versus the $83.42 billion in 50 years, or 2066. And in terms of the national GDP, it does not shrink as much, so only 0.1%, but this in the initial year, but it increases this impact to 0.26% in the future. So these are some of the major economic and macroeconomic indicators, and we look at this impact in almost in all the indicators grow, except for the net export, which suffers initially very high, and then this impacts start to dampen over time. We also looked at, okay, these are this like isolated 500-year incident, which does not happen often, but we can also adjust by the return probabilities of the different storms and calculate their annual impacts or annualized impacts. And these impacts are not very large, so around 0.05% for Texas economy and pretty negligible for US, which perhaps suggests that these storms, at least in terms of the losses, if we expect, in terms of the expected losses, are not very large, but they, of course, could happen every year, and there is the chance of them happening every year. So the mitigation strategies that has been discussed, of course, there are multiple, but in this particular case, we looked at the coastal spine, and we estimate that their mitigating effects could be 80–90% of impacts could be mitigated, if not even more. And in addition, because coastal spine involves some activities in terms of the infrastructure investment, and it's estimated to last for 10 to 15 years, there is an economic boost and activities that could be generated from this construction sector, although it's pretty costly as we have discussed, but nonetheless, the estimated benefits are much higher. And they have also, US Army Corps of Engineers has looked at other types of the mitigation actions, such as ecosystem restoration, beach nourishment, and coastal retreat. Of course, we can leave people to relocate at their own devices, or this sort of autonomous or market responses, or we can have the managed retreat where the government sort of identifies the vulnerable hotspots and moves out this population out of harm's way to have this to lessen the impacts on this, in particular, mostly vulnerable segments of our communities who are disproportionately bearing the cost of and the brunt of these impacts. But this coastal retreats, I want to highlight, there has been some fiscal constraint is a big factor as it appears. Loss of tax base for many smaller communities is a big issue to decide on this planned or managed retreat, because they fear that with their buyouts or relocation, they may lose the tax base because there is no mechanism for them to enforce the relocation within their own jurisdictions. And I also have a research where we look at it seems like this is a factor. Also, more reliant these municipalities are on tax revenues to finance their local service deliveries, like they're implementing this managed retreat. So this is something that we have to consider in redesigning perhaps this federally managed retreat program. And there is also conflicting policy incentives. We know that most of these coastal communities are required to carry the insurance, and flood insurance is primarily subsidized through the national government. And when you have the insurance, you are less likely to retreat on your own or to participate in these voluntary retreat programs that we have. Estimated total cost of these various strategies that has been considered is over 26 billion. And the cost benefits to the cost ratio is over 1, which suggests that they are all good to be pursued. And in this light, it's also important to see what's the public support for the coastal spine or various mitigation measures. And I'm going to present a few figures from one of my colleagues who did the survey, and 7 out of 10 individuals across Texas coastlines support this construction of Ike Dike, as we call it, which is a significant support for these structures. And among the various alternatives, importantly, conservation base, buyouts, and elevation of the infrastructure has greater support, for example, than the construction of the seawalls or the levees that are more structural.
Mary, you've got to come to your conclusion, please.
Yeah, I'm done. This is all. Thank you very much. I'm open for any questions if you have.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so we are. I want to go back and see if anybody has questions. We had a lot of material in this and so let me start with, are there any questions for the Louisiana panelists? Alex, I have a question, and that is, and this goes to you and Jeff, are we going to be able to, if we use the Mid-Barataria example, are we going to be able to catch up with all of the losses that have accumulated that you've demonstrated over a period of time? Is there a point where the losses outweigh the pluses?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and part of it depends on sea level rise and what happens. I think under moderate rates of sea level rise, you can restore, the pluses can outweigh, in terms of land building, the pluses can outweigh the negatives, and you can have net land gain in the near future in this targeted area, right? It's not, of course, this system's going to build, up to 20 square miles, and we've lost nearly 2,000 square miles worth of land. So the Mid-Barataria alone is nowhere near enough to restore the entire coastal system. But it is enough under moderate sea level rise scenarios to have net land building in a modest size area. And I think that sea level scenario is probably what we're thinking about for across the entire coast and the entire coastal restoration plans. Under moderate rates of sea level rise, we can have net land building and rebuild targeted areas, but not the entire coast, and not if global sea level rise rates continue to accelerate rapidly.
Okay, thank you on that. Jeff, do you have any feelings about this, what Alex said?
Yeah, no, I generally agree with him. I think it's more targeted. If you look at older versions of the state's master plan, there were diversions lower in the basin. And I'm not going to put words in the state's mouth, but they're not in the new version of the state master plan, which suggests to me a retreat and defend sort of scenario versus we're going back for the historical footprint of the Delta. And that's all I'd really add to what Dr. Kolker said.
Okay, thank you. Jeremy, if, as you said, the cost of Highway 37 is $5 or $6 billion, and Jonathan showed us several highways in the North Bay that are subject to, that are vulnerable, what kind of price tag are we looking at just for the Bay Area?
Oh, there's been a recent study, Plan Bay Area 2050. We're looking at all the infrastructure in the Bay and the needs for sea level rise. And I think it comes to about 19 billion or so. It's a large amount of money. Some of that, I think working together in terms of like the restorations and the transportation together, there may be some benefits because these projects will benefit both aspects of it, and there's some form of cost sharing, but obviously transportation is a very large ticket item, and it's going to be the big challenge that we have. We need to have changes in policy as much as changing in our engineering practices.
Jeremy, could you send me a link by email to that report you just referenced? I'd like to follow up on that.
Yeah, certainly.
Thank you. Okay, Catherine, what is happening? You focused on Charleston. Is the plan with the Department of Homeland Security to take this model that you described and make it work nationally? And who's going to pay for it?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. Actually, I didn't have time to squeeze that in my 8 minutes, but it's pretty important. Yeah, the idea is the work in Charleston is really about co-developing with the community, with like getting all of that stakeholder input, and then doing the application, which is going to serve as a sort of a model and a tutorial for other coastal communities. But the idea is to roll it out, and this is DHS is funding this. So how the rollout will work and the funding for that, I haven't inquired from them, but that will fall to them. But that is the idea, and they were excited for me to take part in this session because they really do want to get the word out about it. The investment is really about trying to arm coastal communities with a tool that they can use to make informed decisions about adaptation planning. So yes, it will be free and it will be available. And the timeline is the development of the tool is complete this summer and the application is complete in the summer of 2022. So I expect shortly after that lots of outreach will start occurring.
So Catherine, my other favorite question is the Sphinx system, and one that was developed was referenced by your colleagues at Deltares, talks about making calculations conventionally in hours and then in like minutes, that there's a huge saving. Is this kind of a system being more generally applied, or is it still a cutting edge technology?
It is quite cutting edge. It's constantly under development. So this is the compound flood model. It is physics based. Some of the physics have been removed, so it's applicable in some conditions and not in others. So that's always something important to look into, but it does cut the calculation time down by factors like 100. And it is being used by the USGS. We do collaboration with them. It's being used in some development that they're doing all along the southeast coast. We also have a collaboration with the Office of Naval Research, and it's being used in projects there to look at probabilistic surge calculations. So it's getting traction in among federal agencies here. So I think, yeah, we need to be good about outreach and communication, but I think maybe it's good to say also that the tools we develop, so I mentioned Deltares is not for profit, so the tools we develop are also not, there's no cost associated with them, so they're freely available. So we really try to disseminate the information about their existence and what's the use cases for them, so that people will be interested and will join the community of users. I think a lot of you may know the more sophisticated, I guess you could say, the more complex version, which is Delft 3D, which has, I think, the largest community of users in the US. So Sphinx is sort of the faster version, the faster simplified version.
Very good. Thank you, Catherine.
Sure.
Mary, the state of Texas is planning on self-financing a $26 billion coastal spine. Did I get that correctly?
I'm not sure if it's planning to self-finance, but they expect some federal contribution, but it's not final and finalized. So I expect after this maybe big infrastructure bill that Biden administration has put forward, perhaps it would be included somewhere there. But I think Texas can finance this entire cost of this spine. We did the study. In our study, we sort of decided to make Texans pay fully the cost of the spine. And even with that, I think spine is still very beneficial, and Texas economy still gains, and so does the US. So,
okay.
Based on the experience from the seawall, there has been some federal contribution, but also from local cost share was pretty high too. So I expect that the Texas share would be high.
Okay. One question. If you don't do anything, how much is it going to cost?
Yeah, that's difficult to estimate because we did not look at the cost of human lives that are lost or impacted. But I think it's perhaps upwards to 100 billions, if not more, annually.
Very good. Okay, Mary, thank you very much. We are running a little bit behind here. We are scheduled to have a break for a couple of minutes. So what I would like to do is to give everybody a break of 5 minutes, which will get us back to we'll get back at 11:31 Pacific. So wherever you are, it'll be 31 minutes past the hour. And at that point, we have our panelists from the Netherlands, and we will begin with Jeroen Arts, and then Dirk-Jan Balstra from Deltares, and Matthias Bos from Royal Haskoning. So they'll be on next. Take the 5-minute break, and we will see you back at 31 minutes past the hour. Thank you.